everyone to this workshop on teaching students how to learn. Um, my name is Ana Barata, and this is my colleague Tori Love. We work at Rinella Learning Center, and we look forward to get to know you a little bit more, what you're doing and why you're here today, and go from there. Hi, come in. Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Come this way.
Well, why don't we start off by just introducing ourselves? I think there are several folks that I haven't had a chance to meet yet. So, again, Anna introduced us by name, but we both work in the Rinella Learning Center. I'm curious if people heard of the Rinella Learning Center? Okay, so that name is not totally unfamiliar. That's good to hear. So, we're both learning specialists over at the Rinella Learning Center, and I'll share with you all. My master's degrees are both from Miami University. I did my first master's degree in English. I started the PhD program in English, decided that wasn't for me, and I stopped after coursework. So I hadn't done comprehensive exams yet. But then I decided I wanted to do a different field, and so that was when I got into the Master's in Student Affairs and Higher Ed. I feel like every time I tell that story, I joke that it's okay to drop out of a PhD program, but I think the graduate school is not going to like me continuing to say that.
Absolutely. Um, my name is Ana, as I say, Ana Barata. I have a PhD in educational psychology, which basically is learning how people learn. So that's why this topic is so exciting for me, because this is what I've been studying for a long time during my graduate work. But I also am a licensed professional counselor for the state of Ohio, so I also do therapy and counseling, and I have been at Rinella for the past 4.5 years.
And Anna, you did your master's in clinical mental health counseling after finishing your PhD.
I did. Yeah, I finished my PhD, and then I'm a licensed psychology back in my country. And with my PhD in educational psychology, I couldn't do clinical work. And so I went back to school and did my master's in clinical mental health as a non-traditional student with, family and work, full-time job here. And I graduated in December 2018. So I do private practice on my free time.
So you can go back and get more graduate degrees even after the PhD.
Yeah, but I don't recommend that. Yeah, so welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to getting to know more about your learning goals and also some of the challenges that you may be facing um, while teaching.
And I wonder, could we go around quickly? And I'm curious just to hear from folks to see what kind of programs people are from and what kind of teaching experiences you might be going through right now. So if you're doing any kind of teaching or any work with students, and also what program you're from, does that sound okay? Angela, could we start with you?
My name is Angela Putner. I am from Eastern Europe. I am an international student, PhD student. This is my 5th year at Miami in PhD program. I'm a candidate already.
Woo!
So it means that in 2020 I will
Defend?
defend my dissertation and graduate. Yes. Back in Moldova, I used to teach history and social studies in high school for 25 years. In parallel, I was teaching Romanian and Russian for peaceful volunteers. So I have lots of teaching experience. At Miami, I do teach EDL 204, which is Social Cultural Foundations of Education course.
Mm-hmm.
This is my 9th semester teaching it.
Okay.
I like it very much. So, that's me.
My name is Madiha Mohsin Saeed. I'm from Pakistan. This is my first semester in PhD EDL program. And back in my country, I teach English as a second language. I'm assistant professor of English. And this is here I teach Social Foundations of Education 204, and I have just completed my first semester teaching.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Haley. I'm a first year student in the Sahi program, Student Affairs. I'm a GA in the grad school, so that's why I'm here, just helping facilitate, make sure everything's going well.
Oh, awesome.
Alright, I'm Vienna. I'm also a first year. I'm in kinesiology and health, and I'm also a GA here, also helping.
My name is Miranda Strasberg. I'm a 5th-year PhD student in the biology department, actually in the EEB program in ecology, evolution, and environmental biology. I've
Oh.
So most of what you've been teaching is lab, kind of lab, small group.
No, I stopped taught. We have a course called Bio 104.
Okay.
We recruit students. Yeah, I taught that for 4 semesters.
Okay.
And then I've taught a few different labs. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That gives me an idea.
I'm Anna. I'm also in the same department, also a fifth-year PhD student in biology. So I've mostly just taught one lab course and then also the semester. So that one was for non-majors, and I taught that for like 6 years, and now I'm doing a majors lab course. So two different ones.
My name is George Daly. I'm in the geology department, and I'm finishing up my PhD in the spring. And I've been teaching, well, since my time here has been a mix. I've been teaching in geology introductory labs, research assistantships. I'm on GA right now. So my time's been mixed here.
Congratulations on almost being
Thank
done.
you. I understand you wanting to drop out.
Absolutely.
In my last year now, I kind of fully understand that.
It was a happy decision.
More power to you.
Hi, I'm Tara Trueblood. I just came today to make an announcement. Is now a good time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm the director of the Center for American World Cultures, and I wanted to come today to let you know that we're recruiting graduate co-facilitators to co-facilitate dialogues among mostly undergraduate students next semester. It is a great opportunity. We have, this is our second cohort doing this intergroup dialogue, which is dialogue across difference. It is learning how to invite people to discuss the conflict that is already present because of the various privileges and oppressions in our society, to invite them to name that oppression and conflict that's already in the room, and to negotiate that across the room in a way that's respectful and healing and can warm our chilly climate here on campus and in the broader community. But also for our co-facilitators, like I said, this is our second cohort, and those who have been through the program as co-facilitators really do get a lot out of it. From our assessment, they have made some important developments themselves in their leadership and their conflict resolution and dialogue skills. So we do pay $11 an hour, or we offer internships, practicums. If you have a faculty member who will sponsor you for credit, you can get graduate credit for being a co-facilitator. And so it's a minimum, it's either 7 hours a week, or if you need more hours, we can work with you and up to 20 hours a week. So anyway, I wanted to share with you a brochure about the program, which has a link, and there's an application on our webpage to be a co-facilitator. You just ask a couple of questions about your understanding of oppression and privilege, and then ask for a resume. Just a short resume. Anyway, thank you for letting me
No
hop
problem.
in there.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We'll take a couple of these back to our office.
Yeah, we have.
Let me leave you.
Yeah, we have 7 GAs in our office. So.
Thank you. May I bow out now?
Absolutely. Thank you for coming.
Well, this is exciting. It looks like we have kind of a range of different disciplines that people are coming from. And also it sounds like a lot of different sort of levels of pedagogical experience, right? We have some folks who have done sort of K through 12 work. We have some folks who have been here a long time teaching in different subject areas. So I think that'll give us plenty of material for a good conversation today. What do we see next then?
So what we're hoping today that you learn is, or revise, or discuss is how we can incorporate this idea of metacognition into your teaching. And how would that look like regardless of the subject matter, when you want to help students acquire those metacognitive or become aware of those metacognitive skills. And also we're going to learn how to teach Bloom's taxonomy to our students to promote metacognition. They go hand in hand, and I'm sure many of you already know a lot about Bloom's taxonomy, but we're going to just provide you with some ideas of how to incorporate that into your teaching.
Why don't we begin? So I'm guessing probably many of you have had this experience as instructors, not only folks here, but also anybody who might be joining us electronically. Have you ever had this experience where a student tells you that, they are preparing for the exam in your class, they've been studying, they've been doing all the work, they think they're going to do great. That student maybe takes the exam, gets their grade back, and the student realizes they're not doing as well as they thought they would. And they sort of come to you and say, I prepared, I studied, I did everything I was supposed to do to excel on this exam or on this test or with this assignment, and yet I didn't see the results that I wanted, right? Have we had that experience? I'm seeing some nods, right? I'm guessing especially in some of the sciences, that's probably not uncommon. So the goal for us is to begin thinking about, okay, how can we incorporate not just an approach to effectively teaching content knowledge, but also as we teach content knowledge, how do we help students develop the skills to be more effective learners, right? Because we can also think about, we can often think about the skills or the content that we're teaching, but when students are coming to us with those kind of conflicts, they say that they're studying a lot of hours, they say that they're doing everything they know how to do. The issue then becomes clearly that sometimes students don't effectively know how to learn, or that they don't know how to learn in particular disciplines. So that's sort of the big question we want to think about. But we have a fun activity to start us off with this question.
And if you ever done this, don't share.
if you've seen this activity before, please don't give away the
just give away. So we're going to count vowels.
Yeah. So I'm going to share with you a list. What I'd like you to do is to count the number of vowels in each word on this list, okay?
And you're going to get 45 seconds.
45 seconds. Oh, Anna.
To count those.
That's intense.
Yes, I have my timer here ready to go.
Anna's going to be counting.
Oh, yeah.
She's not playing around.
I'm not. So. Okay.
You ready?
Ready to count?
And remember, you're counting the number of vowels in each word, okay? And go.
Finishing.
Oh, yes, that 45 seconds goes quickly, doesn't it?
Okay, 2 more seconds. Okay.
What we'd like you to do now, if you would, try to write down as many of those words from that list as you can remember. I'm seeing some looks of shocked horror as we
just write them down. Even if you think you don't remember, try to remember them. Write them down.
Really? Excellent.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay.
The expressions I see on people's faces when they try to write down the words after this first attempt is always an unhappy look. We'll give you a chance to improve it, though. I know we're all here because we like to be really effective learners, right? So you will have a chance to excel on your next attempt, I promise.
Okay. I see 4 or 2 for a couple of words. Okay, so. Okay, is that the next one?
Do we want the next one?
Is this the...
Oh, this is the one where we ask them how they did.
Is this the next slide? From?
Yeah. Oh. Well, we can go back to this one to show them the list.
Okay. Yeah, you're okay. So how did you do? Write the number of correct items. Let's look at the list.
And how was
Let's count how many you got correct. And write that number.
I'm seeing some things just shake. Nope, not even. So that's pretty standard.
Now, divide the number you got correct by 15. can multiply by 100. What is your percentage? What grade did you get?
Or put differently, let me ask, how many of us would have passed this if this was a test? Probably not many, right?
Yeah.
Do we want to move on?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, so we'll take a look at the list again. And one thing I want you to notice as you look at this list is that each of these words are arranged by number, right? So we see dollar bill is 1, dollar bill is 1, dice is 2, tricycle is 3, four-leaf clover is 4, etc., etc. The other thing I want you to notice is that we're going to try the same activity again, but you have a system for organizing this information, right? So you know that it's by number. But when we do this activity again, what I want you to do is instead of focusing on counting the vowels, what I want you to do is focus on trying to remember as many of these words as you possibly can. Does that sound good? So I'll let you look at this for a little bit, and then we'll try the same thing again. Ooh, that's pretty clever. Angela's writing down numbers, have an analog to go with.
Okay.
And then I'll have you take 30 seconds. Can you write down as many of these words as you can remember? The energy in the room is always different. The second attempt, usually people are bent down, writing furiously, remembering lots of things.
So what was the difference? Let me move. What's the difference between the first attempt and the second attempt?
Would you have passed the second attempt if it were an exam? Oh, very good. I'm seeing some tentative nods. Big difference.
What makes this different? What did we do different? What did you do different? Mm-hmm.
And the prompt was given prior to the activity, so that was helpful in picking the relevant information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you were studying, you were trying to learn that information, but you weren't learning the correct information for the way that you were being evaluated, right? You were asked to learn the vowels, but knowing the vowels wasn't the learning activity you were asked to engage in, right?
So there's two things here that took place. We knew what the goal was the second time. We knew that the specific goal was to, learn the words, not the vowels. So that's becoming aware of what the goal of and the purpose of learning is what we call metacognition. And what happens is many students, they don't know what the purpose of the assignments that you provide them. And so they're studying, they're not aware of that. They're also studying the wrong way, depending on those learning objectives. And also, we had a very good system to learn the information. We used our prior knowledge to connect with new knowledge, and that make the information, we organize different information in a new way to be able to reproduce that information. And so those are two things that are key in the process of metacognition, which basically is what we're going to be talking about today. So we have that video.
The video?
Mm-hmm. So we're going to show a video on metacognition and what does that mean. there's no.
Oh, is there a way for us to play some audio?
Sound is off.
There we go. Very good. Are we still?
No, it's not. Okay. Plan B.
Today we have Dr. Sandra McGuire. She's the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Learning, Teaching, and Retention at LSU, and we're talking about metacognition today. So first of all, what is metacognition?
Yes, great question. Metacognition is, the term actually was coined by a cognitive scientist back in 1979, Flavel, and it really refers to the ability to think about your own thinking. The way I like to explain it to students is, it's as if you have a big brain outside your brain looking at what your brain is doing, and it's analyzing the activities of your brain, asking questions like, is she just memorizing this information, or does she know it well enough that she could teach it to someone else?
So why is it necessarily important then?
Great question, because very often the way that we learn information is determined by the processes that we put in place. And so if you are analyzing how you are learning the information or how you're thinking about it, and it's not just thinking about your own thinking, it's being able to plan the strategies that you're going to use to learn certain pieces of information. For example, if you know that in order to master something, you've got to go through the act of pretending that you're teaching it to someone else, which is very different than just writing the information out or just reciting it and looking at a book. So it's really important because it allows us to move to higher mastery levels of learning than if we didn't actually analyze how we were using our thought process.
Mm-hmm. And how do you become aware then of how you learn?
Yes, I think first you have to recognize that your brain can analyze what it's doing. Very often we just kind of go through study strategies, study techniques blindly. But if you really recognize that, no, I need to step back and analyze exactly what am I doing. Am I using memorization techniques? Am I using recitation techniques? Am I using annotation techniques, writing about the information? And also looking at whether or not the strategy that I'm using is congruent with my learning style. If I'm a visual learner, that suggests that I should be using certain kinds of strategies. And it's the metacognition that allows us to really analyze what we're doing and how we're thinking about the task at hand.
Gotcha. And I know for me personally, I actually changed the way I was learning a subject. It was biochemistry. Okay. And I started just writing over and over again with the different pathways and everything. So, you know, so it seems like, you know, it's never too late to try this.
Absolutely. And what you did actually was a metacognitive act, because you recognized that I need to do something a little bit different. Maybe you weren't writing out the pathways initially. You were just trying to look at it and memorize it. And then you realized that, no, to be more effective, I've got to write it out. And so the metacognitive sophistication, I'll call it, really does increase as you go to higher levels in college and you are required to do those higher level learning tasks.
And these different strategies, I mean, can you give some specific examples? I mean, that one was writing over and over again, I guess, for me.
Okay, absolutely. Teaching the information to someone else. And that's why we highly recommend that students become involved in study groups where you're explaining the information to each other. I've actually had some graduate students say that they bought a whiteboard and used it in their room, and they pretended that they were the professor, and they would go through teaching the lecture. So there are a number of different kinds of strategies. Sometimes people will do a comic book illustration of a particular concept, or they might do a concept map where they're looking at the differences and the similarities of two concepts that might have given them difficulty in differentiating those two.
Okay. Yeah.
How did you find the information about metacognition in this video? Is there anything that got your attention? Yeah, teaching as a way of knowing if you really know the material.
Probably many of us have been in that situation, right, where we were teaching something, and a student will ask a question on the one area that we're not sure about or that we don't have the answer to. Students can always pinpoint that instance. But we can highlight that as an area that we still need to work on, right? Teaching something really effectively points out, helping you know what you don't know, which is the purpose of metacognition, right?
Absolutely. And so, so based on the video, I have this question for you. What is your understanding of metacognition? What are some ideas or words that come to your mind when you think about the term metacognition? How your mind is learning. Any other thoughts? Self-evaluative process, absolutely. Does it have to look the same or different depending on the subject matter? Yes, different subject matters require different strategies to become aware. Some, like I think in terms of biology, for instance, a lot of concept mapping, a lot of similarities and differences in concepts may be important for students to use. I'm just thinking math. In math, is we don't use a concept map, but you have to map all the different formulas, and you have to map the different when to use those formulas. So integrating those strategies depending on the subject that you teach is very important to help students become metacognitive about their own learning.
In concept maps, I would say concept maps, we would describe them as part of a larger body of metacognitive learning tasks called learning representations.
Exactly.
And I'll talk a little bit about those briefly. I know we get into some of those in a bit, but with learning representations, I would say concept maps are sort of one iteration of that. Let me ask, when I say concept maps, do people have a sense of what concept maps look like? So it's something in the center, you identify a concept, and then have different sort of supporting pieces of evidence branching off. But there are also things like using a hierarchy, like sort of drawing a pyramid, right? Thinking about the most general or the most, sort of low-level information versus something that's a little bit higher. We have a hierarchy for you that we'll be using later. With math, I've often found students have success using a sequence as a learning representation. So thinking about solving a problem, if you're drawing out the steps of that problem solution, that feels a little bit different than just diving in trying to solve the problem on its own, right? Another one that I've often seen people enjoy is using a matrix or a spreadsheet. So thinking about how you can compare two different bodies of information. Maybe, if you're in, microbiology, the top of your list is, types of diseases. The categories along the side would be, the pathology of that disease, major outbreaks, different ways that you can represent that information visually. So when we talk about learning representations, that's one way of thinking about how can you practice metacognition, is thinking sort of on the page instead of thinking just totally inside your head, right?
And as instructors, we have that task of facilitating that process using organizers like concept mapping. What kind of tools we're giving our students to help them become metacognitive to a point that eventually they will create their own tools. So at the beginning, we can give them the tools and little by little scaffold them to a point that they create their own tools. We want to emphasize independence in learning, which is, key in success in college. So metacognition is thinking about our own thinking process. Oh my God. Okay, order to be able to think about metacognition and becoming aware of how we learn, we need to become aware that there's different types of learning levels. And so this is what we call Bloom's taxonomy. This taxonomy has been used for teachers for many years when they plan their lessons. But the uniqueness about this approach that we're going to introduce to you today is that we want to teach our students how to use the Bloom's taxonomy to become aware at what level of learning they're functioning. So I just want you to take a minute just to look at the graph that we just provide you. There's different levels. If you want to.
Yeah. So what I would ask you to be thinking about now would be, as a teacher, what are some of the tasks that you have traditionally asked students to do in your classes? So think about what kinds of assignments you often give. Are they essays? Are they tests? What kind of assignments are you giving? Where would you sort of map some of those different assignments that you give students on Bloom's taxonomy? Essentially begin thinking about, okay, if I give these assignments, what kind of intellectual tasks am I asking students to engage in? What level of this taxonomy might they be operating at?
And you can write it down in your, by the verb if you want, like understand, apply, and just said, okay, I have essays, I have quizzes, I have essays, and identify at what level those activities do you think, what is your expectation basically of the cognitive activity that you want your students to engage with?
The other thing I'll add quickly too is to think about your own experience as a learner. So you had mentioned earlier that you maybe have used some of these strategies, but didn't realize that you had a word for this, metacognition, right, as an approach to sort of thinking critically about your own learning. I would encourage you to think about where are you at as a learner in your program. If you're getting to the end of your doctoral program, you may be located more on this level of creating new knowledge, right? That's probably the place that you're trying to ascend to, as a leading scholar in your field. So think about what kinds of learning are you asked to do? Where would you locate those levels of learning for you on Bloom's taxonomy? And begin thinking about how were you able to ascend to those levels of learning? What skills and strategies made it possible for you to get from this place? Because we all probably started out in our field, just at this remembering stage, right? Just knowing, like, oh, this is a plant, this is not a plant, right? What allowed you to get all the way up to this creating level? There are certain strategies that made that path possible for you. And those could also be ones that work well for your students.
So let's think about who can give an example of an assignment that you give in one of your classes. Who would like to share?
We give lab reports in the beginning bio.
Lab reports. So what do the students need to do?
So they do an experiment within the classroom, and then they have to synthesize that experiment into, so kind of describing what they did. So that's really just really remembering and generating what did we do. And then they have to sort of take usually what we taught them and apply it to what they've done. So like you give them like one lab that we do is like they have to select, using different tools, select beans out of a packet. The idea is that different tools you can select different beans. But the idea behind those tools are that they should represent some sort of predator getting prey out of area. So some predators can get prey differently. So, but a lot of times students can't connect that idea of this concept of predators and prey to spoons and beans. But they need to be able to do that for the best, to write the best lab report.
And so do they function only at the level of understanding when they write the report? Or do you think they're getting to what you want, which is application? And
yeah, it really depends on the student, I guess, but we see a variety. I think when they first start in our programs, especially I've dealt with a lot of beginning bio students, they're at the understanding and remembering. That's all they've done up until starting college. And then we're trying to get them to apply and analyze, but that's a little bit, it's hard for them at first.
And so what do you think you can do to scaffold them, to help them to get to the next level when you present the assignment to them, when you say you have to write this report?
I think the big thing is going back and making those connections up front with them. Like this is supposed to represent this, because they leave
So they're very concrete.
Yeah,
Very concrete. So and this is what we're talking about. This is we can use it. We can actually show this to them, and said, okay, the lab report. You have these are the questions in the lab report. What level do you think your instructor wants you to get to? And so you can even have a small discussion. Well, we need to understand. So how would you apply this? And so guide them through that process that to get them to the actual cognitive level that you want them to function for that particular assignment.
And especially for that lab report, I can see the benefit of using Bloom's taxonomy because you see a lot of the tasks associated with the applying. Demonstrate, dramatize, interpret. A lot of those hinge upon the ability to do more sort of representational thinking about a topic as opposed to just literal thinking. And it sounds like sort of that's the leap that you're wanting them to make, right? Is going from just seeing this as like grabbing a bean to being representative of some bigger concept within the field, right?
And the way we kind of structure the beginning part, I always like, start with the basic things. The first lab report, I think all they have to do is a method section, which is strictly remembering what they did. And then they add on to a results section, which is then analyzing those methods, you know. And then eventually you want them in their discussion, the last part, to evaluate what they did and how it was done well and how maybe they could improve it. And then ultimately, what other experiments could you do? What other things could you create to test your ideas? So I feel like the lab report really does every single step of
The Bloom taxonomy. Absolutely.
especially like starting at the beginning and just moving forward the way maybe that's kind of what Probably.
Suddenly there's a logic behind that.
Yeah, right. Wow.
So, oh, sorry. What is this? How can I?
Technical issues again, folks.
Yeah. Well, basically, what I had is the Bloom's taxonomy, but I don't know why it's doing that. But if you, basically, what this is saying is that during high school, most of the students function at the remembering and understanding level. That's what is asked for them in the high school level. So when they move to college, we start college, that's what they struggle because these other skills, they're not able to, they haven't practiced them. So our job as instructor is to help them to get to the higher levels of Bloom taxonomy. So usually undergrads start using application and analyzing, and then grad school, we go into evaluation and creating, as you were saying with the doctoral students. Sorry about all these technical issues. Any other questions or comments about Bloom's taxonomy?
One way I found that's a good way to show this to your students, because I know in 104 we were talking about metacognition, all this, how to get them to relate the Bloom's taxonomy is to show it to a specific concept. So I gave the example with photosynthesis. Like first you have to know, all the components and working your way up the pyramid, because sometimes it's like hearing this create thing, they can't actually understand what that would actually mean that they have to do. So giving them like more of a concrete example of how to get up this ladder, what it means in terms of learning, really helps my students kind of understand where they need to be for their class.
That's awesome. So using photosynthesis as an example.
Yeah. And
Moving
by
back.
the end, I think my top of the pyramid was like had to do with like climate change. So if we increase the number of plants, how could that reduce the effects of climate change? And the idea is plants take CO2 out of it. It's a little bit simple, but the idea was that they should be able to make those sort of larger connections. Or how would you design an experiment to see if that actually helped?
That's excellent. I'll say I've done versions of that with classes I taught. So Anna and I both teach our course EDT 110, which is also learning strategies for college students. And a version of that I've learned would be using the Star Wars saga as a way to think about, the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. I tell them, think about, a level at which you would maybe be the remembering stage. And they say, oh, that feels like something I would do maybe when I was in, junior high, high school. As they progress through high school and their undergrad degree, they see how each of the different levels they're at takes on more complexity. So at the beginning, students will say, just with remembering, maybe I just need to know who Princess Leia and Darth Vader are, right? When you get to the creating stage, maybe you're at the place where you're like, I'm writing my own, fanfic that's creating a totally new backstory for the saga, right? So that could be a way to produce it. And also it builds on maybe some knowledge they already have, as opposed to, thinking about a topic that they might not be as familiar with. I think we've done that with various types of stories. We've done that with Goldilocks and Cinderella.
Yeah, Cinderella. Yeah.
People have thought like, I know who Cinderella is would be the remembering level. Creating my whole, individualized version of Cinderella, that gets you to the creating level.
Now, think about the class that you teach. And in your experience of what students have told you, what do they say? How do they prepare for your class? What have you heard? Because I have my favorite ones, but I want to hear what students have told you how they're preparing for your class. What did they do?
We have some great hits.
Yeah, we have the greatest hits of preparation.
My students tell me because our texts are specifically complex, and we teach students that come from all around Maryland University. So some of them are studying science, some of them are doing accounting, and some of them are education focused. So they tell me that they used to make headings for each paragraph, and then it is easy for them to synthesize those headings and then develop the argument, which is the main argument of the text.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like they're doing a lot of annotating the readings.
Yes.
Okay.
Because readings are difficult, they are philosophical, so they say that they are usually have a heading for each paragraph.
And this is undergrad students or grad?
Undergrad.
Okay, undergrad students. Do you have any exams in the class or just writing?
We don't have any exams,
Okay.
but we have a weekly reflection that we have to submit.
Okay.
That learning class sounds like a really good fit for the kind
Yeah.
of evaluation you're being asked.
Absolutely. Yeah. Other? Yes.
In the previous class I taught, most of my students would have flashcards. It was a really big memorization heavy course, but that, in my experience, was better than other students that said, well, I looked over all my notes.
I look over or I write my notes many times. Those are our hits, like the number one.
The biggest one for me is always, I looked back at my notes.
I look back at my notes. What does that mean? I just look.
Your eyes were open and the notes were like in your line of sight.
I just look.
I don't. Well, I think too, preparing for class, I think of more of how do you prepare to come to class each day, and they don't.
No. Yeah, they just come.
That everything you get them is like they're gonna walk out of there and they know it now. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, and also the book. It's like, do you have a book for that class? And they say, yes, but we never use it. That's another one.
We never use it.
Yeah. We never use it, or it's not. I don't open to study for the class. So these are different ideas that students have about how to prepare for a class. That can be.
It can be pretty meager.
Yeah.
And I mean, depending on where the student might be developmentally, that can make sense, right? Especially if you're seeing a lot of students who are coming into university for the very first time. Probably just showing up was all that was required of them to be successful in their high school courses.
Absolutely.
Just being there and being told what they should do and what they should learn, that worked for them. So they're thinking, why do I need to change that once I'm at college? But then we want to be thinking, okay, how can we get them beyond just, flashcards or just, looking back at their notes? How can we ask them to think about, moving up on that Bloom's taxonomy level to do more engaging kind of activities?
Uh-huh.
Flashcards. That's been around since I don't know how long.
That's a myth.
Does that technique actually work?
Well, let me tell you, it depends on what you're asking, because they use flashcards, but when you do a test that is multiple choice, it's not just remembering isolated information. You need to be able to know if this concept is different than this is the right answer because this concept is slightly different than this. So just memorizing in isolation doesn't help, and that's what many students said, oh, I did a bunch of flashcards and it didn't. They're learning the information in isolation when they need to be able to connect concepts. And so I usually say, go beyond flashcards. Flashcards is just, what they was, the independence of the United States. Okay. If that's the question in the exam, okay.
But usually the question is more like asking about the context, right?
Yeah.
Or asking about some other additional piece of information related to just knowing the date, right? So then just knowing the date doesn't get you very far.
You need to know an example of the concept, but non-examples. And so that's the piece is missing when they are, just using flashcards. And so I suggest that you actually ask your students in preparation for exams or projects, what are you doing to prepare for this project? What are you doing to study for this exam? What are you doing to prepare to write the reflection? Just share with me. And this can be something towards the end of the class that they can just write in a minute paper, and then the next class you read all the, their minute papers, and then you start the class, say, well, I was reading what you wrote, and I found it interesting that many of you are doing this, but I suggest that you can also do this and this and that, and that's it. That's your metacognitive tip of the day. To help them just reflect, okay, is this going to be matching the level of Bloom taxonomy that I'm requiring as an instructor? Are you matching that level? It's a different type.
But then it's not just going, what is photosynthesis and going into this, but taking that question and writing down what is photosynthesis. Because I think I always find that if I don't take it that step further, I think I know it, but I don't. I can't actually put it into words or put it onto the paper. So always, I like note cards personally. I think that's how I learn very well, but I've learned, how to do it the best.
It's a different, there's different ways that you can use note cards. Right. And it sounds like you're, absolutely. Yeah. Especially. But it also depends on the questions that they're being asked. Because if it says memorization, but the questions is not just targeting memorization, flashcards will not. Yeah, but if it is, that's what you need. There's a match between, the assessment, what you are assessing, the activities that you require the students to do, and the objectives of the class. If the objective is memorization, well, you gotta do it. But if you're wanting them to apply and they're studying flashcards but they're not able to apply, then there's a mismatch. And that's what we are trying to help students become aware of. Are you actually doing what you're supposed to do based on the objectives of this assignment?
There is something I want to follow up with something you said about note-take or doing the note cards, and especially this feeling of I think I know it, but then I realize later that I don't, right? This is the danger that I often tell students about with flashcards, is you can fall into this trap of, I describe it as sort of familiarity versus recall, right? So having looked at material for a long time, you can feel like you know it really, really clearly. I always tell people about, I have hand sanitizer on my desk at work. And I sit there, every day, 8 to 5, you would think I know that hand sanitizer really well, right? And yet I couldn't tell you what brand it is or what the label says or even what direction it's facing. I'm familiar with it, but if I had to take a test on it, I would fail that test.
Absolutely.
Right?
That's a good example.
Like using the ability to recall information sort of out of the blue the way that you are asked to do on a test, as opposed to just looking at the material for a long time. And that's what I always tell people can be kind of dangerous about just a very traditional, kind of simplistic method of not just flashcards, but looking back at notes or any of the other sort of like remembering-based learning methods that people often use. Is that can kind of trick you. And that's where students come in and they say, I studied a lot, I thought I knew this material really well.
So, question. You can even ask this question to your students. What's the difference between studying and learning?
Your students will have very interesting responses to this.
We have the top. What do you think? Okay. You think the opposite? Okay. So studying, you're saying studying is short term and learning is long term.
Yeah, like short-term memorization, learning is actually
Any other different ideas or similar? When you ask this to your students, if you have time, it's probably the first time they are forced to think about, oh, studying is not learning, right? And when they provide the explanation, it gets so confusing because, yeah, I don't know if you have examples.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, let me see. So when I ask this question to students, what I often get is, and sometimes there's even resistance to this idea of learning, right? Because students will say, studying, just studying. And when I talk about it, I often describe it as, very goal-oriented. Maybe you're studying more just for the purposes of a test rather than to really know that information. And I say, is that good if you're wanting to maybe major in that or make that your career, right? And they say, well, but studying has worked for me in the past. That's what I've done well with in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll say, well, what about your present? What about right now? And oftentimes I will say, the students that Anna and I are seeing are usually coming to us because things are not going super well in their classes, right?
Yeah.
This is probably also maybe why you might have concern with some of your students is that if they're not doing well, they may have, just that resistance to change. They may think, studying has always worked for me, just looking back at my notes. I did great in high school with that approach. But also beyond that, they may not be thinking about why learning is necessary for them. Studying can feel very immediate. It can feel very gratifying. It can feel very here and now and goal-oriented. Studying will get me an A on that test. So thinking about what are the rewards that students can get out of learning or teaching, right? That can be a different kind of question.
So the learning should be towards the right.
Yeah,
but
we'll push this down.
But studying, the difference, studying can be looked as a work, like something you have to do. It's short term. You have to, as difficult, and it's answering this question of what. Learning, on the other hand, is more enjoyable, activity. It's a long term, like you were saying. You want to learn. Like you're here, we're not giving you any grade right now. We're not assessing you, or you're not earning any credits for being here. You just want to learn, to help students how to learn. You're learning, and answer to these specific questions of why, how, and what if. So it's a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy. And so we ask the students and we show them this is the difference. If you're studying to pass the test. Mm-hmm. And that stay with you one day, and after the test you forget everything. Are you really learning? Are you really learning? Are you going to be able to use this information for your finals exam? How's that going to look like if it's cumulative? And so those are the kind of questions we ask our students to get them to think about, okay, what I'm doing is just a very surface level of learning.
And the idea of learning being fun as opposed to studying being work, I think, can really resonate with students. I'll tell you about a student I was working with just earlier this week. She is struggling in her Chinese class. And Chinese is very memorization heavy, right? Because one has to remember thousands of different characters, right, within Mandarin. And so we talked about how for her, the challenge or the thing that's really, interesting or involving about the class is that she said, it feels like a puzzle to her. It's like figuring out, parts of a whole. And I said, can you make puzzles of the different characters that you have to learn? And I said, truly, can you print out like big versions of words and cut them up and make them into puzzles so you can rearrange them to see, this is how the different configurations of words look together. And she said she had never thought about that. Her words were, she said, I thought like puzzles are just something that you do for fun. And I always tell people, whatever it is you do for fun, whatever excites you outside of life, all those skills have allowed you to be a good learner with things you like, right? So why not use those same skills with your learning in your classes? People I know, students who love sports and football, they can rattle off lists of statistics like nobody's business. If you can memorize that kind of material for something you care about, why not use those same skills in your classes, right?
So, this is the question we ask our students. Would you study harder to make an 8 on a test or to teach the material to a class? What is your answer to that? Mm-hmm.
And what do you think students would say? Students would say they want an A.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. Then the question we ask is, how's this working for you? It's not working well. They don't get the A. And so it's like we encourage them going back to this idea of teaching the material, we encourage them to study, to learn as if they were going to teach the material to somebody else. And we usually use the example. It can be your roommate, it can be the wall, it can be a teddy bear, it can be whatever you find that you are forced to think aloud about your process. And if you stumble and you're not able to say what you're supposed to, say or explain, then there's a sign there that more studying, more learning needs to be happening.
I remember asking this question to my class earlier this semester, and one person said, they explained it this way. This was their rationale. They said, I would work harder to get an A on the exam than to teach something to somebody else. And I said, why do you think that is? They said, well, because studying is hard, but teaching something to somebody doesn't have to be like hard and unpleasant. And I'm like, that's really interesting. So we talked about why that is. If studying has to be hard, but teaching something to somebody else can be like fun and engaging and enjoyable, all those kind of things, why can't that be the method that you're using to prepare for your tests, right? So again, there's that distinction. People think of studying as something that has to be hard and has to be laborious and has to be a pain. It need not be, right?
And the way also we explain to our students is like when you have to explain the concept to somebody else or the ideas to somebody else, that's the only way you will know if you're really understood. And so when they come and say, oh, I just look at my notes. So, and my question is, how do you know you know? And that's a question that you can always ask them. How do you know the material? What evidence? Can you explain that? Can you share? Can you discuss this material in your own words?
And in your own words is really key, right?
Yeah.
The act of translation is such a significant demonstration of mastery of that content, right?
Absolutely.
So thinking about any way that you can encourage students to put material from the way that you're presenting it, just learning it verbatim the way you've explained it, to something that demonstrates that concept in their own words or in their own understanding. That's always really key. And that trips people up, right?
Yeah.
I'll often hear from students, I learned this material verbatim the way my professors taught it to me, so then I can't understand it any other way.
And so with students, I encourage you to ask these questions, like what would, why Bloom's taxonomy? You can pass around Bloom's taxonomy handout, and you can ask them what level of Bloom's taxonomy have you been operating, and they can say, oh yeah, I'm in that remembering and understanding. Well, in this class, at what level do you think you need to be operating now, based on the assignments? You can even use one example of one assignment, said, what is the level for this specific project that we want you to be operating? And so usually students become aware. They're like, oh yeah, I've been just operating on remembering and understanding, and I know I need to be at the analyzing level. So what can you do to get to that level? These are questions that we're gonna present a lot of questions here that are not necessarily for you. It's for students that you can use to help them reflect and become metacognitive. And these are, some of those. These are other questions that we ask in our class, and so think about your classes. How can you apply Bloom's taxonomy to what you're learning? How can this help you to study? So that's a different way of using Bloom's taxonomy. If you're studying just using flashcards, but you know that the questions will include application, how do you need to study? How do you need to modify your studying? There needs to be a match between how you study and the outcome. Also, we do a lot of syllabus analysis of syllabus and analysis of assignments. And this is something that you can do at the beginning of the first week of class with your syllabus, whatever you in your subject say, okay, look at your syllabus, look at the assignments. What do you think is the level of learning that we are asking you in this assignment? Of course, this can be done during the first week of class after you introduce Bloom's taxonomy to them and ask them to analyze the syllabus. Because that will help them to think, okay, this is not just using flashcards. This is not just memorizing what the instructor said. This requires me to provide examples. This requires me to be able to classify information. This requires me to be able to provide non-examples of this particular concept.
And I love the idea sort of explaining the role of the syllabus to students, I often find that students can be very confused about, like, what is a syllabus? Why do we have this? What should I be gaining from it, right? Has anyone ever heard of teacher expectancy theory? Is that a theory people have heard of before? So it's usually used in teacher education, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are some pedagogical tasks that can be really effective. So within teacher expectancy theory, clarifying your own role and clarifying the role played by different, resources or artifacts within the class can be a really significant first step to helping students align themselves and their expectations with what you're looking for in them as an instructor. Thinking about including some of these learning techniques, that's also a really important pedagogical task. Beyond that, thinking about lots of low-stakes opportunities for inquiry. If you're teaching a class that has 3 big tests and that's the entirety of the grade, that doesn't give students necessarily a lot of opportunities to explore their familiarity with the information. Then also just thinking about, who are you as a teacher? What are some things you're trying to accomplish? What is your presence or your ethos in the classroom, right? And are you creating an environment that helps students feel that they can explore and try to figure out the best learner that they can be? I'm sure we've all been in classrooms where the professor made a space for us to become better learners, but also we've been in classrooms where the professor wasn't always accommodating to us exploring how to be a better learner in that space, right?
So then there's another way that you can, help the students um, become aware of their own learning is the study cycle. And we do a lot of this with our students at Rinella, help them to, that studying is not something that just happened. It's something that there's an intention. And the intention is to learn. And the intention is to, manage or, what's the word that I'm trying to, yes, regulate their time, regulate their learning. They need a process, and the process has to be intentional. So
It doesn't just happen.
It just happens.
No one just finds themselves studying, right?
No, absolutely. So this is what uh, the study cycle should look like, ideally. And we usually tell the students, you need to study smart, not hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it requires all these different processes. Many of students, we help them identify, to be in order to be successful in this class, you need to come to class, you need to read, you need to preview, you need to create, you need to self-test, and that's very important. That's the part that is missing. Many of them don't do self-testing. Many of them don't go to class and don't read, and they want still be successful. And so it helps them identify what part of this study cycle is relevant for your class, because it depends on the type of class, absolutely. But you can pass this around to them, and you can find it. Or you do Google study cycle, and you can find this handout. I don't know if you have anything.
Well, and we'll also be sharing this resource with you. But the big thing I often tell students about the study cycle is thinking about attending class and using class time. Again, some things that people have already talked about, right? Synthesizing lecture and reading material, using class time as a learning opportunity, not seeing it as just something that you have to show up to and be done, right? But then after class, I think this is the area that students often kind of forget about. This is the part where they fall through the cracks when they say that they feel like they know the material, but then they get to the test and they really don't. Are they reviewing effectively? Creating the material? This is what gets us into like translation type things. Are they creating some new object out of the material that they've been given? And then are they using that object to test their own understanding, right? So if we can break that down into specific tasks for students, that gives them something that they can follow. Right? That gives them a model they can build on.
Mm-hmm. Questions about the study cycle?
What is the where is this from?
Oh, the, LSU. I got it from Louisiana State University, I think.
Yeah.
But there's different models. This is one of the models. There's another ones that are more like just reviewing. I don't have it on top of my head. But this is based on research. I believe this is what has been, found that to be useful for students, to be effective for them to learn.
I'll tell you the reason we like this model of the study cycle, even though there could be different iterations of it, is because it shows that all of this cycle is iterative, right? So so that we don't think of learning as something that we do just to get through the test, and then it sort of stops here, right? We encourage students to think about how can success on one test then prepare you to continue learning as you move forward within that class. And especially in sciences or in any kind of like STEM fields, the sequential nature of the material makes it really significant that one test is not the be-all and end-all of a student's study lifetime, right? So that's one thing we like to point out is that students often think of studying as a finite type thing. We say that studying should be part of your life, throughout the cycle of the class.
It's a process that you start at the beginning of the semester towards the end. And when students engage in this cycle, in that way of previewing, reviewing, creating, they found themselves that before the exam, they're not just trying to study everything the night before or 2 nights before.
Which is not usually a success for people,
No,
I would say.
not at all. So I'm just gonna just provide you with some strategies that you can use in your class. One of the things that we usually do at the beginning, I'm talking about introduction, first class. What is your goal for this class? What are you trying to get out of this class? Because they can be in your class as a part of Miami plan, and they don't have any motivation because it's a required class they have to take. So how can you find the value? How can you help them find their own purpose for this class? George, you teach what class? What level? Okay, it's Miami Plan? Okay, so many students take that class because they have to take a Miami Plan class. And so how can you make it connect to their own experiences? That can go back into the school setting. It's like, do you talk about earthquakes? Okay, so for me, it's like when I think about geology, it's like, oh, rocks, earth. It's just I have a lot of preconceived notions, right? But if you talk to me about in this class, you're going to learn about this, and you're going to learn earthquakes, and you say earthquakes, I will be like, let's talk about earthquakes. I come from a country that I have been in 3 big earthquakes, so I want to learn more about that. So I'm connecting my prior knowledge to the content of your class. So how can you help them identify what part of that class is meaningful to them to set those goals?
I like this building in ways for students to stop and take stock during class time. This is something I often hear from students when they're experiencing challenges in a class. They'll say, oh, the professor goes too fast during the class time. Or, oh, the professor talks so quickly I can't get down every single thing that he's saying, right? So what I often say is, is there a way that you can stop, or for you, if there's a way you can build in for your class, a time to stop and just say, how are we doing at this point? I call this like pulse taking in my class. I always say, what are your thoughts right at this minute? Stop and write me like 3 sentences about how you're feeling, what you're thinking about, what questions you're having, right? Especially if you get to a point, many of us have probably had this experience, where you get to sort of like a dead spot in the class. Right now, I think is the time where that's hitting, where a lot of us are teaching, and the students are sort of showing up in this, catatonic state, looking like zombies. And I say, let's stop. Let's see what your mind is doing right now. Where are you at right now in relation to what we're doing, other classes that you might be in, all those kinds of things. What that does, 2 things. It shows you, are they having questions? Are they understanding what you're getting? But the second thing, and equally as important, is that it demonstrates regard for the student as a whole person, right? And I feel like that's really significant for thinking about any way to cultivate learning. Because students' whole lives are not predicated on the knowledge for any one particular class, right? And students certainly don't think of their classes that way. Students are not, sort of, especially the students we see like traditionally aged college students, are not doing that kind of mental compartmentalization between the classes. They think of all of their classes as one big tapestry in their lives, right? So thinking about how you can make space to respect and acknowledge that, students respond to it. And again, that can be a way to think about creating motivation or giving them a sense that, you really can see a future for them in a particular field, right?
We talk about how important it is to emphasize learning versus study. Of getting the correct answer. Developmentally, that's where they are. But I think a question that you can ask them, like they got the answer right and it's right, then ask the following question. So how do you get out to this, answer? Tell me how you arrived to this conclusion. What was your thinking process? That by itself is metacognitive. and you can spot their logic and point out, oh, okay, but you missed this piece. What about if you thought about this way? You can point out different way of thinking if you help them think about how they got to that answer. Because probably for them it makes total sense. It's not just the correct answer. It's helping them to think about what is the process, what was my thought process, what was my steps, and what is the...
You remind me of when I used to teach English.
Yeah.
And I would ask students to revise aspects of their writing. And they would say, well, I'll say, well, what made you choose to present this idea? What made you choose to describe something this way? And they'll say, well, that's just how it came out. And I'll say, that's just how it came out. This isn't a belch. This is like your essay for the class, right? So students are often in a space where they're not only not doing that thinking, but they need to be pushed in that direction, right? To think critically about why they made some of the choices they made.
Absolutely. Then the lecture, how you pronounce wrapper?
Wrapper, yeah.
Yeah, lecture wrapper.
Yeah, right.
It's something that you do before lecture or after lecture to get the tone. Like if you do it before the lecture, it's just a way for help them to reflect, to get ready for the process. For instance, an example that we put there is an active listening strategies. You can highlight, well, today we're going to talk about this. I suggest you take notes this way, or how the importance of keep personal devices out of sight. You're setting the tone to what's coming. At the end of class, you can do a minute paper, and that's saying, what's 3 important topics or 3 important ideas that you learned today? What is one question that you have? What was your aha moment today? So there's different ways that you can ask those questions towards the end of class to help them think about what they learned, to help them, become aware, okay, I'm not just sitting here like just taking notes without thinking. It forces me to think, okay, what did I learn?
Did I learn anything?
Did I learn anything? It forces you to think, what was I doing that I don't think I learned anything? Those are the kind of questions we want them to struggle with.
Why am I here? What is truth?
Yes.
If you're in a philosophy class, you can go down there.
And then give practice questions and prompt students to evaluate the readiness for a quiz through frequent self-assessment. If you ask a question, like you have a couple of questions every lecture, and they're not able to answer, that tells you where they are. It gives them information. It's not graded, but it's information that they can use to prepare for the project, for exam, for whatever they have to do. See, that's the part that we're missing here. When I ask the students, how did you study for the test? Just write my notes, read my notes. Did you test yourself? No. Okay.
And then usually it's, what do you mean, test me?
Yeah, what do you mean? I don't, did you predict questions? Can you predict some questions? I mean, those are higher levels of learning that we can start to encourage them in preparation for exam. Also, I think it's important to give a diagnostic quiz early in the term. And it's not necessarily graded, but it's just like, let's see where you are. Quiz. And that gives the information. And then you, after giving the quiz and know the answers and how they did, then you provide feedback. What's going on? What is missing? How are you planning on, learning this information? Do that one.
Yeah, I really like this one, and I would say that I use this a lot. Modeling metacognitive thinking. As you're going through, so I'm imagining in a lot of classes, we probably are in spaces where we're doing a lesson, and we're walking through. This is a problem that you have to solve, right? This is something you might see on the test. Can you make explicit your own thinking process as you're trying to solve that problem? And as you go through, sort of demonstrate the steps that you go through to make that possible? The phrase I often ask of my students is, I talk through something and I say, does that make sense? Does this step make sense to you? From there, and I often find students are pretty vocal about letting me know, like, how did you get from point A to point B? But being able to even ask that question, that's something new to them because they're not thinking about that entire process. They're just thinking about knowing versus not knowing. And you're demonstrating the spectrum upon which they can locate themselves. So modeling metacognitive thinking. All of you are in a unique position, right? Because you're experts in your field. You have figured out the ways to really effectively know the material in your field. So if you can demonstrate to students what effective knowing within that field looks like, they can be experts too. That's something that I guarantee not a lot of other people are really thinking about.
And then concept map, we talk a lot about concept maps today, but
I love them.
yeah, it's useful because it shows relationship between ideas and concepts. But one of the things that I think I found so interesting when I teach EDT 110, the class, I have students from different majors, different departments in my class. We have 10 sections of EDT 110 with around 20 on average, 10 to 20 students per class, who are students who are on academic probation, most likely. And there's an assignment that we ask them to analyze their assignments for one of the courses. And so it's very interesting when I ask them, okay, so do you have to write an essay? Or do you have to do a presentation? What do you think is the purpose of that? And they just look at us like, I don't know. It's for a grade. You know,
I would hesitate to share some of the reasons why students think their professors make them do work.
It's busy work.
Yeah. Some of them are not so generous to the professors.
And I said, well, do you really think that that's the only reason why your professors are actually giving you those assignments? There's a reason behind. And so as instructors, we need to be able to vocalize those purposes so that students find the purpose in that assignment. I'm giving you a presentation because presentation is going to help you integrate information and apply it to a specific concept. I am asking you to write an essay because I want to see how much you do research in this area and what your conclusions are. Like, what is the purpose of your assignments? It's just to get the grade? I'm sure that is not the only purpose. But if we put them out there, say this assignment, the purpose of this assignment is to, I think it gives some purpose to those, and this idea of busy work that many students have may diminish.
Busy work kills motivation.
Yeah.
Right? Probably many of us have seen that, where if a student doesn't see the purpose of why we're doing something, they check out like that. Mm-hmm. And maintaining motivation.
It's that expectancy value theory, you know. If you expect that you're gonna, if you're in a class that you expect that you're gonna do well, and you don't find value in the assignments, your motivation is low. So if there's multiple opportunities of success, so the expectation is like I may be able to be successful, and there's value in this class, then my motivation is high.
And especially if you're teaching courses that are early in a sequence for potential majors, students are seeing that and they're assigning that value to the entire major, right? They're thinking all of this field is just going to be busy work and it's not for me. But you have the ability to show them that there's a lot more to it, right? You have the ability to make them as excited about the field as you were when you got into it, before you started the PhD.
The other thing is, depending on your field, you can encourage students to think aloud. So tell me about your process. Tell me what you're thinking. And we talked already about that. I don't want to take too much about this. But these are some questions that I suggest you can, add to your syllabus or in your lecture when you are participating with students teaching. These are important questions that foster metacognition. Does the information make sense given the information provided? What strategy did I use to solve this problem that was helpful? How does this information conflict with my prior understanding? How this information to relate to what I learned last week? What questions will I ask myself next time I'm working this type of problems? What is confusing? What is the relationship between two concepts? What conclusions can I make? Those are very metacognitive questions that we can embed in our lecture to help students think about their own learning. And also, these are things that you can do as in your minute papers towards the end of lecture. 3 sentences describing what you learned today. 3 questions you have about what we did in session today. Something that you learned that connects to another lesson early in the semester. The most important idea for you for today's lesson. 3 questions that might be on the test. That's a favorite one. And you can even say, I'm going to pick 1 or 2 of those questions for my exam.
That's funny how much students love that.
They love that. It gives them a sense of control. in learning and the motivation gets high. Write an explanation to another student of what you learned, and then switch those index cards. What was the most interesting thing you learned today and why? What confused you about this lesson? And I know it's challenging if you're teaching a big lecture to get all those, but it's so worth it just to, after class, get those index cards and read through that. It gives you a lot of information about their learning process, how they feel about learning in the specific concepts in the class. And also it can tell you where are they metacognitive.
And it can be a good way to sort of, I would say, assess engagement in the class. One of the things I often hear from instructors of the huge lecture classes, which I know tend to be pretty common in the sciences, is that, the folks who are sitting all the way in the back on their laptop, how do I keep them engaged? How do I know that they're paying attention? What is a way that I can be involved in them, their learning experience as a student? This kind of thing is pretty simple, but it asks everybody in the class to have some kind of level of participation, right? And if you're not doing that, if you're allowing the people who are sitting all the way in the back just to be on their laptop and disengage, they're not likely to tune in just of their own accord, right? Because that gets into questions around motivation, whether it has meaning to them intrinsically, as opposed to you just saying to do it. So these things would all be things that would allow the students to participate in some way, even in a classroom that's like Woodstock with 1 million people in it. But it would let you see, too, that people are engaged, they are having thoughts about the material. And that's so hard to find in a huge class.
So there's 2 books I recommend. Well, actually 3. Well, more than 3, but
you have multiple.
I have multiple ones. But Classroom Assessment Techniques, CAT. If you're gonna be a college professor, I recommend it. It gives you a lot of ideas of how to assess learning throughout. It's more like a formative assessment to know how students are learning. Also, and I don't remember the author, but it's called CAT, Classroom Assessment Techniques. And then there's another one that most of the information that we use for our EDT1 class, we got it from this wonderful book, Sandra McGuire, Teaching Students How to Learn.
Mm-hmm. I'll point out that it's Sandra McGuire, SAUNDRA, so if you're searching for that person.
Yeah. And then the other book that I recommend is How People Learn. It has all this science behind learning, and I think it's just resources that you can use if you're going to be teaching either at elementary, secondary, or college level. That will be beneficial for your career in the future. I think that's all we have. Yeah. Oh yeah. You can do Kahoot. Have you ever Kahoot or there's another one.
Yeah, I can't even begin that word.
Kahoot,
K-A-H-O-T-T.
Well, apparently I've used it, and I don't know how to spell it either. Oh, Anna, I'm sorry.
That is. There's another one. It's Pool Everywhere that you can use, and they use their phone. They can use their phone. Teams. Yeah. Yes. That's a great question, because you can even they can submit all their answers. And you can do word clouds. Absolutely, that's what I did. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you have a lot of students, it can be more challenging, but you can use Kahoot and Pool Everywhere, and they are free. There's more like paid versions, but I don't use them.
And I've seen people do iterations of this, like a variation on a sign-in sheet, for example, right? So I would say there could be like some lower fly versions that don't involve the same level of administration on your part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I agree, all of these techniques, the other goal with all of this, and I think this is something, we've talked a lot about ways that students can learn more effectively, but also all of these techniques could make your life as an instructor so much easier, right? Because then, I mean, I'll tell you, when I was teaching English, my heart broke every single time I had to give a low grade on a paper, right? And I feel like we've all had that experience. And if we can cultivate an environment where more people are excelling, where more people are being successful and knowing the best ways to learn, you know, that'll not only help the students, but it'll also help you be a better teacher. It'll help your motivation, right?
Yeah, and we as teachers, we have our own philosophy of teaching and learning, instructors. We do, and we bring with us to the classroom um, a lot of misconceptions about why students are not doing well. And so I encourage you to revise those as well, because some of the misconceptions can be, oh, students are lazy, oh, they don't care, oh, um, they're bored, oh,
Entitled.
they're entitled. I mean, some of them may be true, but not all of them. And so um, being able to revise those misconceptions and say, okay, let's assume that this is not the only reason why. So what's happening in this classroom that I can help them to get to the next level, the potential that they have. I mean, we cannot assume that everybody who is not doing well in the class, they're not doing well because they're lazy. And so it's an encouragement just for us to also think about our own teaching and learning practices. As instructors, I think it will make our life easier and more enjoyable. For instance, I teach the EDT 110 class for only international students. And it can be very challenging for language reasons and so forth. And but I think if I go into that teaching with the assumptions that they're not going to learn or they don't understand, or I'm missing a huge opportunity to reach them. And so just think about your assumptions.
Well, I'm going to try to be cute and ask you all to follow some of the advice that we've given. So before we finish up today, I'm going to ask you all, what is one thing that you can apply in some teaching environment that you might be in this semester within the next week? Even something as quick as that. What is one thing that you think you could implement this next week in your teaching to allow students to develop metacognition or cultivate that within your class? Is there one thing that kind of jumps out at you? One thing that you would like to try? I'm curious to hear from you all.
My students, they don't actually have tests in this class that we're teaching. They only write lab reports.
So,
So I think it'd be really valuable to have them do a little self-assessment through this lab report
yeah.
what they can work on to make it better in the future.
Absolutely.
That's excellent. So a self-assessment on the lab report. Any other things?